Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor James Ankins. Professor Ankins and his co-author Alan Guelzo wrote the new book, The Golden Thread. Well, it is a book consisting of two volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And I wrote a review of Volume 1, and today we're going to talk about the books, The Golden Thread, but mostly Volume 1. So, Professor James Ankins, why did you and your co-author decide to write that book? What is the golden thread? What does it mean symbolically?
Well, the golden thread is a reference to the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. You might remember that he is a mythical figure in Greek history who decides he has to rescue uh, some Athenian youths who have been captured by the Minotaur, and he goes into the labyrinth of the Minotaur, which is on Crete. And he's worried about getting back out again, but he has a lady friend who gives him a spool of thread, which is sometimes described as a golden thread. And he unrolls it as he's entering the Minotaur, the labyrinth, the Minotaur. He defeats the Minotaur, who is usually a symbol of perverted technology or just, human monstrosity. And he saves the young people from the monstrous technological robot created by some wicked inventor. So anyway, the idea of the golden thread is that we're going to provide a thread allowing people to escape from the labyrinth of the present and reconnect them with their traditions. And the project began, about 5 years ago. Well, even about 5 years ago, Alan and I were asked to create this book, a Western Civ book, they called it, for Encounter Books. And Alan and I have known each other since high school. We've kept been friends for well over 50 years now. And we liked the project, but the main reason we undertook it is because we felt that it was time for schools in the US, above all, K-12 schools, to go back to the study of Western Civ. In recent decades, people have stopped doing Western Civ in their classes. It was basically thrown out of K-12 education and college education sometime in the 1990s and was replaced by global history or by no history at all. So if you go back into American history, let's say to the 18th century, when the country was founded, or even before that, while it was still a colony of Britain, everybody read pretty much the same history when they were in school. So the founding fathers, would have read Greek history, Roman history, especially Roman history. They would read the history of Christianity, and they would read the history of Europe. That was just what you did in school. And that was the case really down to the 1970s, that people were well informed about the history of the past. And that gave them a common vocabulary for discussing things like politics and literature and philosophy and music and art. And they had a common educational experience. But starting about, mid-1980s, Western Civ stopped being taught. Western Civ is the label under which the history of the West was taught in the 20th century. And the claim was made that it was a recent fiction. It was, this is the Vietnam generation, right? So they blamed Western Civ classes for militarism, things like that. But they didn't realize it was a much older tradition than that. So they did away with Western Civ courses, which were thought to be, parochial. This is a period of multiculturalism and globalization. So the educational authorities at the time decided that history needed to be globalized. And they were responding, of course, to the economic situation. The 80s and 90s were the great decades of globalization. But now, if we go look back over this 40-year period, maybe 50-year period, when Western Civ hasn't been taught, you discover that there's been damage done by the loss of our tradition. Right. So if you talk to any of my students at Harvard these days, they would not say that they're Westerners, right? That would have been the universal self-identification in the 1960s. We're Americans, we're from the state, we're part of Western civilization. They thought of themselves that way and might even be proud of it. Nowadays, people are not proud to be the heirs of Western civilization. They often at Harvard, they'll see themselves as globalists or cosmopolitans. And as you know, there is a kind of negative version of Western Civ that's been promulgated by more radical elements in our society who are trying to tell us quite falsely that the Western tradition is vitiated by racism and sexism and slavery and all these things that are really characteristic of all civilizations before modern times. But they've created a sense in people that Western civilization is something to be ashamed of. If they do study it, maybe they'll pick up bad values. But Alan and I just don't believe this. We think that people are losing a tremendous amount by not studying Western Civ. So that's really a very, very long answer to your question of why we did this project. And that's it, that we think that it's just too big a learning loss, that people need to go back and start studying Western history, know about the Greeks, know about Roman history, the Roman Empire. They have to know about history of Christianity. And so that's what we're doing.
Great, excellent. It is excellent because Western civilization is unique. Western law is impartial and objective. China, even today, is a rule by law society, not a rule of law society. The West was the first place to industrialize. The Christian church formalized the legal system of the West, and the Westerners abolished slavery. Not only did they abolish slavery, but the British, when they were in Nigeria, they paid African elites to disallow human sacrifice. No other region did that.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yes, in the Oyo Empire, no other region did that.
Huh. Well, the Islamic world, had slavery till quite recently. They eventually did away with it, but I think it was under pressure from the West that people came to feel that slavery was wrong. And the Islamic world felt embarrassed that it still had these slave systems.
There is a book by somebody called Murray Gordon, Slavery in the Arab World. I read the book, and that could be the name of it, but the writer's name is Murray Gordon, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Slavery in the Arab World.
Yeah, I think I ordered that. I read it somewhere. I saw it.
Yes, it's free. It is free online. And there's another book again. This is edited by John Ralph Davis, Slavery in the Muslim World. Slavery in the Muslim World, John Ralph Davis.
Yeah.
A volume 1 and a volume 2.
I'm looking at my Amazon results here because I know that I recently bought such a book, but I don't remember the name. I buy far too many books. I lose track of what I've ordered, but I think I ordered one on that subject, but it will take, here it is. This one is by Justin Marozzi. It's called Captives and Companions, A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade in the Islamic World. And that is not even out yet. It's coming out in October, but I ordered it in advance.
The second book that I refer to is titled Slaves and Slavery in Muslim Africa,
Yeah,
Volume 2, The Servile Estate, edited by John Ralph Davis. I read that book some years ago.
yeah. I read an awful lot about
And
slavery.
sorry, not John Ralph Davis, John Ralph Willis.
Okay, I'm assuming that this is being recorded and I can recover these names
Of course it is.
later
Yes.
on. Yeah. So I read quite a lot of books on slavery because I was aware that one of the things that the West is always criticized for was the slave system. And I wanted to get a more global sense of how slavery operated around the world. So one of the things I found is that, yes, indeed, the Romans did have a slave society. They make a distinction between civilizations and countries that have slaves, and then civilizations and societies that depend on slavery economically. Right. So Romans were definitely a slave society, but the Greeks maybe were not so much. And there are all sorts of balancing elements in this. That the Greeks, for example, they very rarely had slaves to work large estates, right, the way the Romans did in Sicily and other parts of Italy. But they didn't ever offer citizenship to slaves once they'd been freed. It just was against their whole way of thinking about politics. But one thing that makes the Romans quite enlightened, I guess, from our point of view, is that you could easily be freed. There were a lot of freedmen in Roman societies, and you could become a citizen almost instantly. Either you or your children could become a citizen if you had been a slave earlier in your life. And they even at one point allowed the slaves to fight in the Roman army. Right, that was frowned on by many Romans, but they did have freedmen in the army eventually, and so that there is a rather enlightened view about social mobility in Rome, such that there was a emperor at the end of the 3rd century, Pertinax. The emperor Pertinax didn't last very long, despite his name, which means pertinacious, right? Someone who hangs on, but he didn't hang on very long as emperor. But he was the son of a freedman, and that would be just unthinkable in Greek society. So then I started studying Islamic slavery and also slavery in China, and it looks as though slavery in China is much less of a moral horror than it is in Rome, because it really was a moral horror in Greece and Rome. Just the mere fact of enslaving another person, having property and man, obviously. But so China doesn't really have that. They don't have property. They don't have the same attitude to property as the West does. So they don't have chattel slaves, but they do have slavery. They have slavery, household slavery, basically. People sell their labor into a wealthy family and become household servants. But it's a kind of private agreement. It's not as though that person is owned and can be bought and sold. So it's a different kind of slavery in China. And so if you're, Chinese, you might say, oh, well, China's much better than the West on slavery. Except that what they don't tell you is that there's a lot of unfree labor in China. So when the emperor comes through with his workforce in the summertime and you're trying to work the fields, the emperor can tell you, leave your fields and come build a canal for me. In other words, they have forced labor and you can't say no. The emperor's got soldiers. So it's not chattel slavery. It's not ownership of human beings by other human beings, which is a definite moral horror, but it's still unfree labor. So I gradually became aware, and Alan, my colleague Alan, who wrote the other half of the book, he knows much more about slavery than I do.
Yes, Alan. But slavery is quite an interesting topic to study. The
Yeah.
idea of slavery itself is not interesting because slavery is a universal. Even today, there is still slavery in the Congo, in Libya. Illegal slavery is still being practiced. But what I find interesting about slavery is that slaves in Brazil owned slaves. Slaves in Africa also owned slaves, and there's a case of a slave in the British Caribbean who owned a slave.
I didn't know about that. That's very
Yes, so slaves owned slaves too. In Africa, it was not unusual for slaves to own slaves.
another
Got
strange.
many examples
Yes,
of slave owning slaves in Africa.
yeah. Well, you know, that another strange variant of slavery is that slave soldiers. The Islamic world, as you know, I'm sure,
Yes.
they use slaves to fight for them. And that seems very strange from an American perspective because we don't think of slaves as willing to fight for the South. But the Islamic world, went into Illyria, into southern what are today the southern Slav lands, and just grabbed people, Christians, and took them back to their Constantinople or Istanbul or someplace, and they turned them into slaves, but they trained them as soldiers. You must know about this, I'm sure.
What I also know about is the illegal enslavement of white Americans in the 19th century. There's only one scholarly article on that topic by Calvin Wilson and this co-author. It was published in the 90s in Slavery and Abolition.
Well,
But
that's
in
another
America,
thing.
yes, during the 19th century, there
Yeah,
was a thriving illegal slave trade and white people were enslaved. Some of the victims of white slavery went to court and the judges didn't always believe them. Even though they were white, there was a tendency to side with the slave owners who were capturing white people and selling them as slaves, even though they were white.
right. Is
And
this
Carrie Lane Merritt, she mentioned it a bit in her book.
wow? I didn't know about that. This is in North America.
Yes, in America, the United States of America.
I had no idea about that. I know that there was white slavery throughout the medieval period. The Islamic world liked to raid the southern coasts of northern Europe, the southern coast of Europe, Italy and France and Spain, and they snap up people and turn them into slaves. And there were actually societies throughout the Middle Ages who raised money to redeem slaves. So they go to the slave entrepot, the slave markets in Libya, for example, or Morocco, and they'd buy them. They raise money from Christian countries to buy Christian slaves back and take them back to Europe. Very few people know about that too. That's something I explored in my book. I was very interested in, because we always have the people who are trying to tell everybody that the West is a slave society forget a couple of very salient facts.
They do.
One is that Europe itself was a slave market for Islam. Throughout the early Middle Ages, it was so poor. Europe was so poor at that time, after the fall of the Roman Empire, after the Islamic conquest, that the only thing they had to sell was their labor. And this is true of all poor countries, that people would rather sell their labor and even enter into slavery or some kind of arrangement to survive, because they can't survive in their home country. So Europe itself was a gigantic slave market from basically the 7th and 8th centuries. And it's only after that, after the 9th century, really, that Europe was rich enough that Europeans didn't have to sell their labor. That's one thing I discovered. There's a great book on this written by my colleague, Mike McCormick at Harvard. It's a huge, huge book called The Origins of the European Economy.
Yeah, and I know Mike McCormick. I know that name.
Good. He's a great historian. The book is really hard to get your arms around because it's, first of all, just literally a huge book. But it's really it was very, let's say, controversial when it came out, because my colleague's a Harvard historian, they have to pay attention to him.
Yes.
And he was saying that Europe was a slave entrepot. And what really made people mad is he said that the city of Venice, which everyone loves, is the most beautiful place in the world, got its start as an entrepot, as a market between Europe and the Islamic world selling slaves. So you can imagine the Venetians did not think this was edifying at all. And they held a conference against him, actually, to try to show that they were not that way, but they didn't succeed.
No, but what I don't like is when people say that Europe or America was built on slavery. I have a counter response, and I've written about this in many articles, and my counter response is quite simple. In the non-Western world, the primary business was slavery, especially in Africa. That was the business. In the Islamic world, their business was slavery too. The difference between the West and the non-West is quite simple. Western countries were operating at a higher level of rationality. It's not politically correct to say this today, but that's the reality. Westerners were quantifying their research. They were building agricultural research societies. They were paying managers. Their management of slavery was more formal. As an institution, slavery functioned in the West. It was a form of entrepreneurship, whereas in the non-Western world, people were selling slavery. It was a business, but it was not a formal business.
Well, I think yes. One thing I discovered, and well, I kind of knew this ahead of time, but I covered it in great detail while I was researching my book, was that the West is just incredibly legalized society.
Yes.
Any other major society, even the Islamic world, which has a deep tradition of law. They have 4 major schools of law. But West is so legal, and everything is controlled by law, including slavery. And there are protections for slaves as well as ways to exploit slaves. And they allow the exploitation of slaves. The canon law of the church is in conflict in some ways with the civil law of the Romans. Because the Romans allowed slavery, they had restrictions on what you could do to slaves. You couldn't kill slaves in the later Roman Empire and things like that. And if you were cruel to slaves, you could have them taken away from you, and you could be punished by the imperial system. They would reimburse you for the slaves, but they would take them away from you because you had treated them cruelly. The Christian Church, or the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, develops a canon law. And one of the things the canon law says is that Christians cannot enslave Christians. Muslim law, by the way, says the same thing. Muslims can't enslave other Muslims. That's why they have to go to Northern Europe or the Baltic or Black Sea or to Africa to find slaves, because they need to go to non-Muslim countries to get slaves. But the West has the same rule in the canon law. So when the Spanish went to the New World in the 16th century, they had all sorts of protests coming from, especially the Franciscan order, that they were enslaving the people in Latin America, the pre-Columbian peoples, and that meant that the Franciscans couldn't convert them to Christianity. So there's a struggle between the planters who wanted, slave labor, and the Christian religious orders, especially the Franciscans and the Augustinians and the Dominicans. They wanted to convert the natives, right? So eventually they had to change the law so that there's no actual slavery. By the end of the 16th century, there's not really actual slavery. There's other systems of unfree labor, but there's not that. But there's a lot of light and shade in these stories. I really need to find out about. I never heard about white slavery in North America.
Yes, I can send you the article after the interview.
Okay.
I wrote an article and I cited it, so I will just look for the article that I cited. But yes, there's only one scholarly article on the topic. One.
Amazing. Well, it's not really amazing because it's not a piece of information that's aligned with the current.
And do you know what's also quite fascinating? Many abolitionists wanted to abolish slavery because white people were being enslaved. Some of them made that note in their arguments against enslavement in America.
So again, nothing. I'm not an Americanist. Maybe I would know.
Yeah, you're a Renaissance historian. I know.
Yeah, but that's very interesting. And my friend Alan, who I wrote the book with, knows everything about slavery. He's a Civil War historian, an American historian, so he could probably help us out here if we had him on.
Yes, but slavery is not a topic that I like to discuss because I don't find it interesting. I don't find slavery interesting because slavery was everywhere.
Yeah, no,
But for some strange reason today, people appear as if slavery was only practiced by white people in the Caribbean and America.
Yeah, well, that's wrong. And it is boring. I mean, I never studied it formally as part of my research, but I felt when I was writing this book that so many people have a wrong idea about slavery that I need to say something about it. But the book is not about slavery.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah. The book is about the Western tradition and how what the Greeks invented and the Romans invented gets passed down to the medieval period and how it's transformed by Christianity and ultimately how Europe as a civilization gets started in the 11th century and how it also absorbs not just Greek and Roman and Christian, but also brings in the Germanic elements from the barbarians who conquered the Roman Empire in the 5th century. So European civilization is a blend of different civilizations, in fact. And that's what I was trying to get at. It's a blend of different civilizations, but also civilization itself is something that's extremely fragile.
Okay, quick question, James. I think that you should underscore this point that the concept of a civilization is a European concept. That word is European. That's an important point that should be underscored. Civilization.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe it goes back, it has different names, right? So the Greeks, when they talk about civilization, they say Greek versus barbarian. For them, anybody who's Greek is civilized, and anyone who's not is barbarian. And their word is, just the Greek word for Hellenismos is the Greek word for Greek. But when the Romans come along, the Romans conquered the Greeks, and the Romans can't say it's Romanitas that's civilized and everybody else is barbarian. They don't do that because they know the Greeks are civilized. So they use the word humanitas, right? So humanness. So the civilized person is someone who's fully human, and the person who is barbarian is someone who's less than human for a variety of reasons. Now that doesn't sit very well, obviously, with the modern sensibility to call anybody less than human. But the Roman idea was that you could become more human, more humane. They didn't think that the barbarians were very civilized because they lived entirely for war, and they lived in small towns. They all spoke different languages. They didn't share in the common language of the Mediterranean, Latin and Greek. They couldn't access books for that reason or go to school. They were kind of stuck in this very backward society that mostly was concerned with making war. They moved around. They didn't have any fixed abode, or they didn't stay in any one place long. So that was the Roman idea of being less than human, right? You didn't have the great teachers. You didn't have Plato and Aristotle and the great models of civilization that you could imitate. So it sounds as though when you say barbarians are less than human, that you're saying something contradictory to Christian principle, which is everyone has dignity. But really, the concept is about degrees, that they are human. The barbarians are human, but they could be more human. And if they joined Roman civilization, they would learn Latin. They would have schools. This is what happens in Great Britain when the Romans come to Great Britain. They're faced with a choice. This is in Tacitus, right? They're faced with the choice of how we're going to conquer this people. We can either do it through military means, which will cost us a lot of money and maybe lives and treasure, or we can civilize them, turn them into Romans, which is what they did. When they conquered Britain in the 1st century AD, and there was a Roman magistrate known as Agricola, who was part of the ruling party there, the ruling force there, he said we have to civilize these people, and when they civilize them, they will not need to be subdued by force. We'll send them to school. They'll learn to read Latin. They'll become part of our civilization. They'll take baths every day the way that we do in Rome. They will dress the way we do. They will sympathize with us, and we won't have to keep them under constant surveillance and military supervision. And that's what happens. Anyway, so I don't know what you think about that, Lipton, but I think, to me, that's an acceptable idea. But you're right that the term civilisation, the French term, was invented by the Europeans, and it's an updated. I think it's the 16th century that's first attested in French, but it also refers to civilizing as a process. Right, as a process of becoming more civilized and less civilized. And this is really the thing that's most at my heart in writing this book, is having people remember what civilization is, because we're forgetting that. We've forgotten that. And you can see it in the incivility with which we treat each other in modern societies. That would be considered ungentlemanly, unladylike, uncivilized. You would place yourself outside the community of educated people if you behave the way modern academics are behaving.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm glad you agree.
I'm not agreeing for the sake of agreeing. I am agreeing because I'm a lover of Western civilization. That's why I'm agreeing.
Well, everybody should be a lover of Western civilization.
They should, and they should be a lover of Western civilization for many reasons. The most important reason is that Europeans were the only colonialists with a true civilizing mission. Based on and I've read several books detailing the history of empire from Asia to Africa, and the Europeans are the only people who had an official policy of civilizing the people they colonized. The only people. No other group of people were interested in the education of the people they colonized. No other group of people, well, the Vikings were also Europeans, they assimilated into Christian culture. The Mongols weren't very intellectual, so they had to do some assimilation, but no other group of people had a formal policy to civilize the people they conquered. None.
Yeah, and it's not so Christianity is part of the civilizing process. But I had a wonderful student, who now teaches in Hong Kong, who discovered that whenever the Europeans went around the world, they went and they established colonies. They did try to Christianize the people, but they also tried to civilize them. They gave them classes in the same education they had, Latin and Greek, and they taught them to speak in Latin. He's found all these wonderful speeches by natives of the Indian Ocean and Chinese and Japanese and Filipinos who were given a Western classical education by the colonialists. So, and that's, to me, absolute evidence that they wanted to civilize those people.
Well, many people don't know this, but there is a growing literature on the positive effects of Christianity in Asian countries like China and Japan. They build medical and academic institutions, introduce modern industry. Paul Cohen's article is quite old, maybe over 20 years, but it's still pretty good. So I've read quite a number of the books published by Cambridge on the history of China, and some of them cover Christianity in China.
Yeah. Yes, well, I think people should love Western civilization. I think they should also love Chinese civilization too, because the Chinese were a very successful society for a long time, and I think they were. This is kind of heresy to say this, and maybe I should be more careful. But I think the Chinese actually did government very well for a long time. And we can learn from that. But when you compare the Chinese civilization with Western civilization, just quantitatively, there's just so much more in the terms of art, literature, music, um, and philosophy, architecture. The West is richer, and it's not a fair comparison in a way because the West is a aggregation of four civilizations, right? The Greeks, the Romans, the medieval Christians, and the Europeans. So it's not a fair comparison. The Chinese have always been Chinese. They're in the same part of the world. They have great continuity, which is a wonderful thing. But I don't think if you compare it sort of pound for pound that you would not see that the Western civilization just has more to offer in terms of its artistic and literary.
But what you're saying is quantitatively true. There is a book by Charles Murray, Human Accomplishment.
Oh yeah,
There is a new book that will be published soon. I don't remember the name of the writer. Let me. I know the name. Let me Google his name. His name is Yashong. He's of Chinese descent.
yes,
He wrote yes, yes. Let me look for it. Yashong, East Asia Education. Yes,
you found it.
I'm looking. I'm looking.
Yeah,
Looking for
I
it.
know the Charles Murray book.
Yes, the Charles
I'm
Human
sort of-
Accomplishment.
Yeah, I'm kind of a fan of his, although I shouldn't admit that either.
What did you say?
I said I'm a fan of Charles Murray, but I should not admit that either. Because,
I'm a big fan of Charles Murray too.
Yeah.
This book is so the book is titled "The Rise and Fall of the East" by Yasheng Wang, and he had a second book coming out. And this book is expected to be controversial because in it he argues that the Song Dynasty did not represent the apex of innovation in China, and during that period, innovation was declining in China.
Hmm.
That's
yeah,
what he said, and he's an expert.
yeah, I wouldn't consider myself a great expert. I'm very interested in Chinese history. I read it
Me
all
too.
the time just for entertainment, but I'm not an expert on it. I know
Yes,
that the Song actually do have a lot of innovations.
yes, they are. But his argument is that people often say the Song Dynasty in China was innovative. It was innovative, but it also represented a decline in innovation. So it was not the watermark that we think it was.
I would have to read the book before
Yeah, I'll have to read this book too.
your judgment on it. But it's true that I think in general Chinese civilization is more stagnant.
Yes.
And the reason I say it's not necessarily a criticism. You know, the southern Italy, for example, which I've studied much more extensively, was stagnant for a long time. It was the northern part of Italy and Western Europe, and England, and Germany, and which were the innovative places. Southern Italy was poor, it was stagnant, but I'm not sure it was unhappy. And they're different things. And China was, I think, much less innovative than the West. They didn't have the competition between the nation states that we had. That's what causes a lot of this innovation. It starts in military realm and then spreads to other parts. The Chinese didn't have that kind of intercivilizational rivalries going on. But, and you know, mathematics is a great example of that because the Chinese never got beyond fairly simple arithmetic and maybe some algebra, and they were hostile to learning mathematics.
Well, there's this scholar called Kent Deng. He's of Chinese descent and he writes well. I've interviewed him before, and whenever he has a new article that's enticing, I tend to read it. But based on what Kent and some other experts have written, they argue that human capital in China was relatively high, but China had a different philosophical foundation, and for the most part, the pre-industrial China was not a theoretical culture.
What kind of culture?
Was not a theoretical culture. It was not theoretical culture. So
that's right. That's certainly
exactly that was the issue in China. So the Chinese, they are technology, but not science. Science and technology are two different variables.
Yeah. No, and that's actually a mark of Western science from the very beginning. It tries to combine theory and practice. That's where Western medicine comes from. You know, the Egyptians had medicine for thousands of years before the Greeks, but the Greeks were the country that figured out, the nation that figured out that you had to have some kind of theory of medicine, which they got from contemporary Greek science, and combine it with observation and with testing and experiment and collecting clinical data. The Greeks are the ones who developed the science of medicine,
Yes.
and you can say the same
And
thing.
history. They developed the idea of history too. History is not just the collection of random stories.
Oh, yes, I think that's right. I mean, I have studied this to some extent because one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is always to keep in view so the reader can be able to make their own judgment of the sources that I'm using. And so I'm talking a lot about history and who the historians are, where we get the information that I'm using to retell the story of the West. And it is clear that what the West is doing right from the beginning, right from the time of Herodotus, is something that's an order of magnitude greater than anything we have from Babylonia or Egypt, right? The Chinese historiographical tradition starts centuries after the West. They start in the Han Dynasty, right? So the West is historiography has serious historical writing for about 4 centuries before the Chinese do. But the historiography is different from the beginning because Herodotus is doing research, and he that's what history means actually originally is research. And he's telling a great story, a great narrative, and he has characters, he's got motivation, he's got parallel development and independent invention, all these things that we talk about today when writing history. It's already there in Herodotus. So if you go back and look at what they call historical records in Babylon or in Egypt, what they really are king lists, and occasionally lists of deeds that kings have done during their reign, or pharaohs, and their stories and myths, but it's not history in the Western sense, right? It's certainly not what Thucydides is doing, which is, I think Thucydides has yet to be surpassed as an historian. I think he's one of the great historians of all time. But I don't know anything like that. And Chinese historiography is very rich, and I admire it in all sorts of ways. But I don't think it has that kind of analytical depth that you get in Thucydides.
And the paradox of Chinese society is that although Chinese society, and I'm using the term on average because obviously there were exceptional people,
Yeah.
but the Chinese, they wrote books, but many of their books did not address the application of theory to solve commercial problems. Europeans had more books on useful knowledge.
Yes.
That's Joel Mokyer's term, useful knowledge.
Yeah. I think that's true, and it's partly because Western civilization is much more expansive, right? Starting with the Greeks. The Greeks were out there colonizing the Mediterranean. They needed to know about other peoples, and then Alexander the Great conquers all of these places in the ancient Near East, Egypt and Persia, and they need to know about them, and they even need to know about India. So if you look at histories that have been written, most of which don't survive, most of what we know about the Mauryan dynasty in India comes from Greeks. And a lot of what we know about Egypt, until they figured out how to decode hieroglyphs, most of what we knew about Egypt came from Greeks. And Babylon, the Greeks were writing dozens of histories about the world around them because they were interested, partly because they had to rule them in the case of the monarchies that came after Alexander the Great, and they wanted to know about those people. But when the Spanish go to the New World, they want to know about the country they just conquered. So, and they preserve the records of the conquered, which is very unusual.
Yes, because Europeans are not tribal. They're the least tribal people on the planet. Wherever they went, they made documentation of biology, botany, and
Yeah.
human beings. In India, colonization led to a resurgence of of interest in ancient Indian philosophy and art.
Yes. No, and a lot of that is a lot of what we know about the history of India is, or at least the archaeological record and the artistic record of India has been preserved by the British. The British destroyed a lot of stuff too, um, but they also preserved it and studied it. And at a certain point, the study of India, it's always, the British are always claimed for being, or blamed, sorry, the British are always blamed for Orientalism, right? That they were trying to control the other countries through their control of history and ethnography, and they were presenting other countries as inferior and using their control of scholarship and history to do that. But it's not really true. It might be true for some people, but what happens is that if you read the actual Orientalists, right, the people who study India, they love India, right? They're fascinated by it. And in some cases, they will defend India against the British. British people who are too quick to condemn Indians for being backward or superstitious or having false religion or whatever. It's the Orientalists who are speaking out and saying, "No, guys, you don't understand. The Indians are a very deep, complex civilization. They have philosophy, they have literature, they have things that deserve to be studied and preserved." So it's really not. It's really a kind of, I think, a travesty of what Western scholars have actually done in foreign countries.
Even this argument about decolonization is utter nonsense. Decolonization is not a conceptually relevant term in Western countries because Western scholars are global and they have always been global. Even when they were racist, they were global. There's an article published by this academic. It is titled "The Greek Origins of Cross-Cultural Comparisons," saying that the Greeks they invented the idea of cross-cultural comparisons and tolerating other cultures, and I
Yeah.
don't find that hard to believe.
It's in Herodotus. That's what Herodotus is doing. In fact, that's the big theme of his history. He's doing the origins of the Persian War, right? So he wants to know why the Greeks and the Persians fought, but he sees it as a civilizational conflict, right? That there's something fundamentally different about Greeks and about Persians, and he wants to understand what that is. So that's what he's doing in the early books of the histories, is comparing the Greeks with other parts of the world, particularly Egypt and the ancient Near East, right? So yeah, you're absolutely. Whoever writing this, I haven't read this article that you mentioned. I think that there's good grounds for it already if you go back to the beginning. What's the article by? What's the article by you
It
mentioned?
is titled "The Cross-Cultural Origins."
Yeah.
The Greek origins of cross-cultural comparisons, and it's published in the Comparative Civilization Review by BYU University.
Yeah, so this is a new experience for me. I've done quite a few interviews in my life, but I don't usually have to take notes during them. Usually people are taking notes for me, but I'm taking some notes here. Okay.
And do you know what I find so strange? Well, not everybody, because I was born in Jamaica. I went to high school in Jamaica and university in Jamaica and then university in Scotland. But I find it strange that some intellectuals in non-Western countries are talking about decolonization. Yes, they don't need decolonization. They need the recolonization of history. They need to learn more about Europeans because Europeans already know a lot about them.
I'm not sure what you're talking about. Who's recolonizing who?
No, I'm talking about ideological recolonization. I'm saying that decolonization of the curriculum, that's a popular idea today. That you should decolonize the curriculum. That's why you wrote your book, because of the war on Western civilization.
Right. Oh, I
So
see. Yes,
Yes, so I'm saying Western scholars, they know a lot about the non-Western world. So non-Western people, they need to learn more about Western countries. So they should not be saying, okay, decolonize the curriculum, because Western professors, they did that years ago.
Yeah.
They
No,
did it years ago.
I see what you're saying. I run into this phrase a lot about, it's a kind of activist phrase, decolonize the
Yeah,
curriculum.
yeah, it's silly. Even in Jamaica, even a country like Jamaica, the curriculum was decolonized years ago. No, even if you go back to the 1960s, there are textbooks, and these textbooks were written by black academics, and many of them overturned what we know considered to be Eurocentric arguments. So there's no basis for decolonization. It's just activism, no basis whatsoever.
Well, this is something that also has to be brought out, and I tried to bring this out in my history, that the West has undoubtedly done and many evil things. I mean, the Romans were not very nice when they conquered peoples. They commonly, like other peoples, killed all the men and enslaved the women and children. That's what you do when you conquer an ancient city. They did terrible things. And the Roman slave system was certainly a rival of the Islamic slave system for the worst in history, maybe worse than the Islamic slave system. But the thing about the West is it's always criticizing itself.
Introspective.
Yeah, you find people already in 4th century Greece who are saying slavery is wrong and we shouldn't be doing it. And you find Christian thinkers who say that that slaves should love their masters and masters should love their slaves, and that we're all equal, masters and slaves. They don't quite say that slavery is wrong. They do eventually say that, by the way, in the 4th century AD. There are Greek church fathers who say that slavery is wrong, right? But the West is always criticizing itself, and it criticizes itself for also colonization, right? If colonization is done in the wrong way, the famous example is Montaigne, right? In the 16th century, the essayist who
Yes.
is.
Did he invent the essay? Did he invent the essay?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, you should also say that. That's a Western invention.
Well, the Greeks invented most of the literary genres that we still have today, right? The Greeks invented tragedy and comedy and history and lyric poetry and epic poetry, and you can hardly name it. The Romans invented satire, okay, but the Greeks invented most of the standard genres of Western literature. And the novel, too, is a Greek invention. So, although the ancient novel is quite different from modern novels, but nevertheless, when you talk about the Western tradition, one of the things you're talking about is its artistic, literary, philosophical traditions. And we are still using all those genres and forms and categories and arguments, and we're still imitating the Greeks in our sculpture, and we're doing new things all the time. But the bedrock there is the tradition that we've inherited.
The Promethean spirit.
Yes, which is rather dangerous.
That's the beauty of the 21st century. In the 21st century, we have quantitative evidence to support our assertions. So rather than saying, okay, the Chinese were more innovative or the Europeans were more innovative, we can actually read studies. And that's my issue.
Yeah.
There is such a great disconnect between what quantitative studies are showing and what people are seeing. It makes no sense.
Yes, well, I agree with you that the historiography, people see what they want to see, but they're just not studying these subjects anymore. At Harvard, I've been for 40 years. I've taught at Harvard for 40 years. We have lost 6 European historians in the last 15 years. None of them has been replaced. We haven't hired a new senior faculty member since 2007 in any Western subject. And we don't teach. I'm the only person at Harvard teaching ancient history. Isn't that incredible? You can study Indian history, you can study Jewish history, you can study I'm talking philosophy, I meant philosophy. You can study Jewish philosophy, Islamic philosophy, Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, but you cannot study ancient Greek philosophy. There's nobody else but me, and I'm retiring, teaching Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, Epicureans, Augustine, all these authors that used to be the standard curriculum at a place like Harvard. And now I'm the last person teaching it.
Augustine is an important intellectual, the city of God.
Yeah.
Separation of powers. Probably Augustine was the first person to truly hint at separation of church and state.
Yeah, it's a different concept, I think, what he's doing. But one of the things I think he does that's valuable is to tell the Romans that the Roman Empire is not God's plan, right? Because once Constantine was converted in the early 4th century, a lot of Christians said to themselves, the Roman Empire's divine providence, that God has converted the Roman Empire to Christianity. So now the Roman Empire is God's vehicle for the Christian future. And then, of course, what happens is the barbarians sack Rome in 410 AD, and Augustine has to rethink all of this. But Augustine's view is no, that God is not on the side of any one nation, right? That God's providence operates in different ways. And, Einstein says that God does not play dice with the universe, but he sometimes plays chess, right? And he takes the pieces off the board that you thought were so important to your defense or your offense. So the Roman Empire got taken off the board for Western Mediterranean, and Christians had to come up with new institutions and a new civilization, which they eventually did. In the West, in the Latin Western part of the Roman Empire, they had to come up with a new civilization, which they did in the 8th century with the Carolingians, with Charlemagne and Charlemagne's civilization, which was more Christian than the Romans. So, if you, So your point, I think, are you interested in Augustine? Is Augustine one of your?
Yes, I am. I am a fan. Like I've not read enough of his primary work, but I do like secondary literature. It's easier to read. So I read the Cambridge Companion and some other companions to Augustine.
Right. Well, you should read the Confessions. I mean, the Confessions is fantastic. There's not that many ancient men or women, for that matter, that we get a sense of what they're like personally. It's basically Cicero and maybe Socrates, that you can really form a kind of sense that you can talk to that person, right? But there's so much Augustine that survives. And then there's the Confessions, where he's just revealing his heart to you, right? And trying to be honest, I think, because he's telling you his story in the presence of God. So he can't lie in the presence of God. It's an amazing thing. And I think everybody should read the Confessions of Augustine. You want to understand Christianity. That's the one text I would read.
I agree. Christianity is an important religion. Nothing irritates me more than when people say Christianity retarded science during the medieval ages.
No.
That's a foolish comment, because even if you're not a scholar, and any person with a cursory understanding of medieval philosophy would know that Christian intellectuals were obsessed with Aristotle. So if science declined during the medieval ages, it was because of Aristotle, not Christianity, because Aristotle was the man of the medieval ages. How could people forget that? How can you say Christianity retarded science and not say that Christian scholars loved Aristotle? How?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Aristotle, Dante calls him the master of those who know, right? Il maestro di coloro che sanno. And that's because Aristotle was the backbone of the university curriculum from the 12th to the 17th century. That's what you did when you went to the university. You studied Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian science. And the only way that we get to modern science is through Aristotle, right? And it's through testing Aristotle for truth, which they were willing to do. They were willing to test to see whether Aristotle was right, and they found out he wasn't right on a lot.
Exactly. The conflict between Christianity and Aristotelian science led to modern science. That's what they call the Duhem Yaki thesis.
You're absolutely right about that. And it's also the case that modern science is not something that was invented by atheists. It was invented by Christians. And people argue about this, but certainly Leibniz, all the great philosophers of the 17th century, well, probably not Hobbes, but he claimed to be Christian, but he wasn't Christian in any real sense. But it was modern science comes out of a movement to find a more adequate scientific basis for Western theology. Right, that Aristotelianism and Platonism were not, by the end of the 16th century, people could see that the differences between those two systems and Christianity were too big paper over. And they wanted to come up with new philosophies which would be more adequate philosophical, scientific environments for Christian belief. I think we have to accept Hobbes in this, but certainly I think Descartes thought of himself as a Christian, and Leibniz was a Christian, and all these great thinkers of the 17th century were trying to preserve the essence of Christian civilization by revising its science.
There are some academics, they contend that science emerged in the West due to the theological conflict between Christianity and natural philosophy. And without the peculiar nature of Christianity, the modern West would not have created science. So the argument is not necessarily that science birthed Christianity, but that Christianity's philosophical foundation was so peculiar that it stimulated questions that led to modern science.
Well, it's certainly the case that at a certain point, it was easier to maintain that Christianity and modern science were irreconcilable. I think that alternative really doesn't become powerful until the middle of the 19th century. But up to that time, very few people thought that science was incompatible with Christianity. There were few people in the French Enlightenment who thought that, but they were really a small minority. Most of the Enlighteners, and I hate that word, but that's what people use, the Enlighteners are moderate Enlightenment. They believe that they want a more rational Christianity. There's even Catholic Enlightenment people that Ulrich Lehner has been writing about out at Notre Dame. There are people within the Catholic world who want to enlighten the Catholic faith. And he argues that's where modern Catholic social doctrine comes from. But it's it's really with Darwin that people start to feel that Christianity and science are incompatible. I think Darwin is the real game changer there. But so there's this period from basically 1860s through 2010, where people just thought that Christianity was incompatible with science. But Christianity's been fighting back, as you probably know, and there are theologians and scientists who try to come up with more effective ways of understanding science, which are compatible with not just Christianity but other religions as well.
But Darwin was an interesting character because many of the people who supported Darwinian evolution were Christians. Many of the strident critics were not Christians.
Yes, no, I think that's true. I'm not an expert on Darwinism by any means. I used to teach the origin of species and descent of man when I was a young teacher, but I haven't taught that stuff in many years. But I hear what you're saying, and I wish I could learn more about that, in fact.
Yeah, and look, I am not any great scholar. I don't have a PhD, but it's good to read books, especially these days with the computer. So most of the books I read are online. They are free books. And whenever I listen to perceived experts, I'm always irritated because of the gap between the quantitative and historical literature and what these experts are saying.
Yeah, well, academics belong to tribes like everybody else. You say that Western civilization is not tribal, but I think the universities are tribal, and people don't want to get, they don't want to, part with the herd at all. They're afraid of saying something that might, put them outside the herd. So they say things that are completely irrational and uninformed, just to stay inside the herd. And that's, unfortunate.
Well, I don't know if I wrote a review of this book for the Mises Institute. I think that this book is going to become his magnum opus. Ricardo Duchesne wrote about the uniqueness of Western civilization, and he wrote a second book that was published earlier this year, Greatness and Ruin. I read it and wrote a review, and also academics like it.
Yeah, I thank you very much. What's this other book that someone wrote earlier this
Yeah,
year?
it's called Greatness and Ruin. A lot of prominent academics they like it.
I see. And who's the author?
Ricardo Duchesne, the man who wrote The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, was
Okay,
cancelled. Yeah, he was cancelled. Are you familiar
I
with
know
that
who he
story?
is. Yeah, I know who he is.
Yeah. Ricardo Duchesne was cancelled, a cancelled academic. But I like him. I think he's the best defender of the West since David Landes.
Well, I knew David Landis. I know his son too.
I'm a big fan of David Landes.
Yeah. Well, his son is also a historian. I knew
A
him.
literature professor, right?
Richard Landis. I think he's in Israel now. He's I'm not sure he must be a professor. But David Lansford, I think that I agree with you that the Revolution in Time book I particularly like.
Yes.
He's written a number of top.
Prometheus Unbound, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, I'm a big. I sometimes I wonder what would Harvard be like today with David Landis teaching.
no, we threw him out of our department.
Seriously, I really wonder. I really wonder what would academia be like today with somebody like David Landis who did not back down any at all.
No, well, I think we're in a fallow period for genius in the academy. Maybe that's the result of all this politicization and political agitation, but it's hard to think of major figures. There are always some major figures at Harvard. When I first came to Harvard in 1985, the place was lousy with genius, right? There were millions of genius. Well, I would say there's several dozen people at Harvard at genius level, and I don't think that's true anymore.
No, but there is academic Bruce Charlton. So Bruce Charlton and somebody called Ed Dutton, they wrote a book called The Decline of Genius. So some writers are saying that genius is in decline in Western civilization, and I tend to agree. Like obviously, there are bright people today who produce first quality research, but we don't have those overly interesting academics like Carlos Cipolla anymore. They just don't exist.
Oh, I'm a big fan of Carlos Cipolla too.
Yes, they just don't exist.
Well, yes, I think there's all sorts of reasons, internal incentivizing reasons, but I think it's also true of the arts and music and literature. It's hard to think of, who are the major figures of our time. There are people who are bestsellers, but how many of those people are really writing great books?
Exactly, like those type of academics, they just no longer exist. Like there are still bright people who write interesting books, but we don't have those intelligent and charismatic academics who can produce new research, groundbreaking research. We rarely have people like that today.
There are periods that just have great intellectual ambition, and I think the U.S. after the Second World War was one of them. But in the Renaissance Florence, which I've studied a lot, there's a period when everyone's trying to do great things, and they're encouraged to do great things. They're trying to create universal encyclopedias. They're trying to make a one great religion that will involve all world religions. They're trying to revive, the ancient church, and they're doing all sorts of enormous cultural projects. But that kind of dies out in the 16th century. And we had another moment, I think, in the U.S. after the Second World War, where there's a lot of genius, a lot of people with big intellectual projects, and people who were ambitious really to understand nature, human nature, history. I don't know that that is still around, at least in the areas of history that I know.
There is this leitmotif today: the white male. Universities are tired of reading dead white males. They're tired of wild white old men. Well, I'm a bit different. I personally resent the decline of the white male academic. It's something that worries me quite a bit. Like, you're how old are you now?
I'm now 70.
Exactly my point. Like, I resent the retirement and sometimes the demise of people like yourself. I really resent it because I like to be intellectually stimulated, and I'm just not getting good research from all the people these days. The best people are like old men like yourself.
Thank you.
No, so I'm upset.
No, I like being 70. It's
Yeah, I'm upset.
well, there are signs. There are good signs. I mean, after I retire from Harvard, I'm going to go to a new institution called the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic
I
Education.
met a young man who is a fellow there. Yes.
Really? What's his name?
I will tell you after. Maybe he doesn't want me to say his name, but I'll tell you after.
Okay, so this is University of Florida.
Yeah,
And
yes, I met him.
this place has hired 50 people in real, who are really good people in 3 years, and we're going to hire more. Harvard has, I think, currently 14 people who teach Western subjects, Western history. And so the Hamilton School is going to have 24 and probably more, probably 30 by the time they're done. So twice as many as Harvard. They're young, they're hungry, they're incredibly talented. So, new institutions will rise up to replace the old ones. I'm confident of that because there is too much intellectual ambition in the United States to be thwarted by all these speech codes and politicization and DEI enforcers and so forth. I think that people will find a way to express their intellectual ambitions, find places to do it.
Yeah, so when you retire from Harvard, that's where you're going to go and teach. That's good.
That's where I'm going. We're going to build a really great program. We are already building a really great program. My friend Alan Gelso, I told you we wrote the book together. We've known each other since high school. We're going to end up, both of us are going to Gainesville, Florida to be part of the Hamilton School. And I'm expecting to have another chapter in my academic life down there.
Great. I'm excited. If you ever need somebody like a David Landis who's going to talk about the uniqueness of the West, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're ever looking for a David Landis like character,
all right.
who knows really, economic history.
Yeah. It's really great to meet you, Lipton. And I've never taken so many notes in an interview before.
Well, to be honest, I am planning to wrap up, but there's another book that I'm looking for to share with you, written by this academic of Chinese descent, but I just can't. I might have to send you the email.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'll have to do.
Yeah, send me an email because I'm not getting any notes here.
All right. So, yes, thanks for coming on. Speaking to you has been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure and great to meet you and great to hear all your ideas and bibliographical references, which I'm going to have to follow up on that.
All right. Thanks.
All right. We will end. You can end this now, I guess.
All right.